They point out that kind of the extremes on both sides are the 14% or the MAGA conservatives. And then on the other side, 13% are staunch progressives. And when you really think about the system in the United States, to get to run for office, you got to get through a party primary. And those two groups are basically the deciding votes in the primaries, right? So they're the most motivated, most extreme people.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Hey there. Welcome to The New Rules with Alan Pence, where we help you navigate today's chaos with precision. Your host, Alan Pence, has 25 years of experience working in business and government, and he knows how the old rules have fallen apart. Each episode, we'll explore how to thrive in this new landscape by mastering the new rules while everyone else is still figuring them out. Let's dive in.
All right, we're back this week, Tonya and I. How's life in beautiful suburban Barcelona?
Beautiful San Cugat. It's good. It's good. I can't complain thus far.
Do you want to reveal the town you live in? People might track you down.
I think you did that last week.
Oops, I added you. Okay.
That's all right. We'll keep it on the DL. We don't want other people to discover how awesome it is.
Well, you guys have those water guns over there that you squirt Ferris with, so you can just do that if anyone shows up.
That is true. I have stocked up on my water gun supply.
Excellent. All right. What are we starting with today?
Let's see. So you were talking about Thomas Pueyo. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right either, and renewable energy. So you were reading something that he wrote, and you had said that you actually learned two very interesting facts about renewable energies that you didn't know. And you've been pretty attentive to solar energy. So tell us what you learned, Alan.
Yeah. So the first was just about solar costs. So I think like a lot of us know that solar costs, panels, the physical equipment has dramatically dropped, right? So some of that, some people thought that was mainly a Chinese subsidization and cheap Chinese energy to make them. So like subsidized cheap Chinese coal was making renewable solar panels. But I think it's inarguable that, there's a technology cost curve there that you see just like, with televisions or computers and stuff like that, right? So I think we've all known that. But Thomas writes about how, that's only one aspect of the cost of solar. So I think probably the big picture thing here is green energy is a key energy for us going forward. I don't dispute that at all, but particularly solar has a scaling problem, right? So as the technology exists right now, it requires large amounts of space. And then the other scaling problem that he pointed out that I hadn't really thought about was what he calls the soft costs. So those are, you got to put it on a piece of land. So you have to have the land, you have to get the solar panels there, you got to have labor to come in and install it, you have to have electricians to hook it up.
Permitting, all the things that you don't like, everyone's nightmare.
Yeah, everyone's nightmare. So, those costs really aren't going down, or they don't go down anywhere near as fast. So really, could we hit this point where solar, the cost curve stops going down, and as a result doesn't become any more scalable? And the author points out that there are a bunch of things we can do to bring down those soft costs. So, we can redesign the system so they're easier to install. He was talking about, like some of them are just sort of like you can just dump them in a field and hook up put an input into it and start using the solar, right? So you don't have to do all the stands, and you can design them in certain ways so that you can put more in the smaller space.
Double-sided.
Right, double-sided. And I think the other thing that he pointed to is like the innovation potentially there is like at some point, solar could just be like an adhesive roll that you bring around, and it's like, hey, I need to run the tractor. So you just stick some solar on it, and the solar, adhesive, and it can run the tractor, right? So, obviously that doesn't exist today, but so that would get rid of a lot of the installation, labor costs, land costs, right? So that's a potential going forward. So that was like a couple of the key learnings, but then that kind of led me into this thinking that he goes through about the importance of energy and why it's so critical to what I think about in the new rules is like, since the beginning of time, really, energy has been the key, or since the beginning of humans, the ability to harness energy has been what creates our standard of living and partly what makes us distinctly human, right? So it was really the ability to master steam power that spurred the Industrial Revolution.
We started out with fire, making fire.
We started out with fire, burning wood, right? And if you could, there's a great guy, Vaclav Smil, who is a professor at Canadian University, who has written some books about how we transition from fuel source to fuel source and how that has driven quality of life and how long that takes to do, right? So the other thing the author points out is this thing called the Adams curve. Some Henry Adams developed, I think, about last turn of the 20th century. So in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and he created a curve that showed, basically we consume about 2 to 2.5% more energy each year as a modern society. So it's basically like the inflation rate, right? And so he shows a curve just smoothly sloping off into, infinity, basically. And the really interesting chart that's in the piece, I've seen a couple other places, is that shows our US actual energy use against that curve, which is just, obviously it's just 2.5% every year, but it shows how we go up and down around it, but vaguely until about 1970 to stay on that trajectory. And since then, we've basically gone sideways. And so what is that saying, right? It's saying that we potentially have regulated ourselves into a lower standard of living going forward. Now, I bet a bunch of people will object to that and say, hey, well, we've conserved a lot of energy. We've focused a lot on how to do more with the same. And that's all true. But the reality is, I really read a lot. This guy, Burke, it's a group of people, but a main guy who write a Substack newsletter, a lot about energy and a lot about commodities. Yeah. And so his line is energy is life. That really hit me. And it is true. Like, even if we're doing more with less since the 1970s, why can't we do more with more, even more with more? So we would all be a lot better off today if we had just kept on that curve. Now, it's a little simplistic, right? You could say, well, if we had another conservation, we'd have the same standard of living, but using more energy, blah, blah, blah. I get it. But the reality is we've got to get out of this degrowth constrained mindset around energy and technology. We have to understand that in societies that stagnate are societies that have conflict. So if we want to get out of the political deadlocks we have, if we want to see a world of abundance, we have to harness more energy. And I think we're seeing, as a result, and that this piece goes on, it shows how, hey, solar can be scalable if we do these things. Now, I'm not going to wait 10, 20 years for solar to suddenly be scalable and battery technology along with it to say, so I'm not going to hold my energy use constant and wait for that to happen, right? I think we should be doing everything. We should be bringing a lot more natural gas online. It's plentiful in the United States. To be honest, Europe could frack it too if they would get out of the slow suicide pact they're in. And I feel like energy is one of the key things that I'm writing about this week that's holding the EU back. But I think that we should be building more nuclear, right?
I was just going to ask you about nuclear energy because you have talked about that before.
Yeah. And I think nuclear is really important going forward because, one of the problems with renewables is the sun doesn't always shine, right? Or the wind doesn't always blow. So you can solve some of that with massive battery storage. But the reality is you need baseload power, and we certainly need it today. And so until I can stick solar panels on the side of my tractor or my car, I think we need to continue building. To be honest, like right now, the main thing we can build is natural gas. It's a lot easier. Nuclear is harder. It takes longer. Even if we did regulatory reform, it'll still take longer. But we should definitely be pursuing it because we're going to have some percentage of electricity generation in the United States and Europe and other countries that provides baseload power. And nuclear is just too good a solution.
It still has the stigma. I think that's part of the stigma of past.
Yeah, I was hearing this guy, Noah Smith, talking today about how The Simpsons started every episode with like a three-eyed fish by Homer's power plant that he worked at, right? Nuclear power plants. So The reality is, when you look at current nuclear technology, it's extremely safe. And we actually overbuild it, right? And no one is like, I think one person has died as a result of a nuclear accident, and dozens, hundreds of people have died as a result of or thousands of other energy projects. And solar has killed a lot more people than nuclear ever has. So I get it. It's not going to be 100% of our electricity generation, but it has to be an important part. And particularly if you want to decarbonize at some point, natural gas is a better solution than coal. And we should go immediately to that. But, in the end, nuclear is already a renewable source of clean. Not 100% renewable, but it's close. And it's a pretty good solution to baseload power with zero emissions. So we should be doing it. So the point being, look, solar, it's going to be great. We're going to have a lot more of it. It's going to take some time to do all the stuff that's written in this article to make it happen. We can't wait, because every year that goes by is another year where a bunch of people are living substandard lives. And it's just not responsible of us. And it's cruel, to be frank, to deprive people of that energy that makes their lives better. And if you look at that, it's a good, go to the newsletter and take a look at the chart there. And you see this just flatlining of energy use. And I highlighted, I linked to, it's a little kind of funny, but it's called WTF, happened in 1971. And sort of the basic message is that's when we started putting in all these kind of degrowth initiatives, like heavily started regulating environmental, there are a lot like the National Environmental Policy Act, there's Clean Air Act, there's Clean Water Act. And look, I'm not saying we don't want those things, but they've now, given the administrative state that built up around it, those have now become a straitjacket that's basically stealing standard of living away from the United States and the rest of the world. So things that started out with good intentions have now been perverted into something that, quite frankly, it's, I talked a lot about trade last week. We'll talk about it this week, but the assault of the trade policy of first our allies and then China, combined with the degrowth energy punch, is what resulted in stagnation in the country. And that's why Trump's on the ticket. I think it's why people are rioting in the UK. And it's why you see the rise of far right-wing parties all over Europe. I mean, partly the immediate cause, people say, is immigration. And that is part of it. The reason they go to immigration is because there's a fixed pie mindset. And that's because the standard of living isn't going up fast. So if there was abundance and everybody was making a ton of money and growing, and bringing in new people wouldn't be quite as difficult as it is now. And it's, pretty famous that when we experience tough economic times, people go and blame the outsider or the other. And so, I'm not saying immigration is a complicated issue. There's good and bad aspects, but it is true that the less pie there is to go around, the more people start looking at outsiders and blaming them. So that's where I see the connection.
In some places of the world, it's counter. I mean, if you think about the low birth rates in Europe, for example, immigration could be something to help that. But it's such a complicated issue, and there are so many different sides to it. And like you're talking about, piece of the pie, how to grow that.
And I think, we'll talk more in the future about Europe. I think Europe has very difficult issues with culture and immigration. The way the United States doesn't quite, we have echoes of it here, but people tend to integrate in our society more. It's less culturally cohesive here. We tolerate more inequality. We have all those things, whereas Europe really doesn't. And so
we don't even have an official language in the US.
That's right. There you go. So, and you have how many do you have over there? 7 in Spain?
In Spain, there's 6. Actually, I shouldn't say. I'd have to count.
There you go.
Well, it ties you. One of the things you talked about the Doomsburg article, and after that, you went into echelon groups. Was an article that you had included in your latest post, in voters and voter distribution, and it's not what people think, right?
Right. And actually, I thought a little bit. Yeah, I saw this earlier this week or late last week, and I've thought a little bit more about it actually since then. So I have some different thoughts in there in the newsletter. But essentially, they did a bunch of polling trying to understand exactly who the groups are within our two-party system. And they've kind of decomposed it into 8 different clusters of voters, each around 10 to 14% of the electorate. And kind of what they show is that about 38, 39% are kind of right leaning, 38, 39% are kind of left leaning, and then there's kind of apolitical moderates in the middle, and some what they call big government populists. So I thought it was an interesting way to look at it, because first they didn't really talk about this, but they point out that kind of the extremes on both sides are about 14% are the MAGA conservatives, right? And then on the other side, 13% are staunch progressives. And when you really think about the system in the United States, to get to run for office, you got to get through a party primary. And those two groups are basically the deciding votes in the primaries, right? So they're the most motivated, most extreme people. And so it's, like a lot of people here, especially where I live, have some fantasy that, Nikki Haley is going to be the nominee and win if Trump loses this election, or even if he wins for 2028. And my point is that her part of the party, which they call Reagan conservatives, is only about 10% of the electorate. So they're, first of all, outnumbered by the MAGA conservatives. And I think between the MAGA conservatives and what they call right-leaning populists, who, they really outnumber the Reagan conservatives. So I think someone like Nikki Haley is out. To be honest, you see Dick Cheney, it's kind of a Reagan conservative endorsing Kamala Harris this time around. So I think there's a real rift there. And I think you're not going to see that, somebody like Marco Rubio, who's tacked more MAGA and more populist, is probably much more likely. And then on the left, you've got this problem where you've got to go crazy on, to be honest, the economic issues, those are, I think, on the left and the right, they're fine. I think it's more on the, culture war issues, the DEI and extreme trans stances and those kind of things. So like getting out of the primaries without being completely damaged with all the other groups is pretty tough on both sides. And I think what I kind of surmised from it is that whoever can get out of the primaries and win what I think is the main group up for grabs, which they call big government populists. I want to learn more about that. That's a little vague to me.
So, yeah, tell us what that means.
Yeah, so they say it supports, this group, they're about 12% of the electorate. They support strong government action on all fronts, from controlling immigration to economic regulation to vaccine mandates. I was like, do I know anybody like that? It's a weird combo. Like, I don't know a lot of people who want to control immigration, regulate the economy, and want vaccine mandates. I mean, maybe.
I'm sure there's somebody. I don't know anybody personally.
I would sort of look at them, if I'm getting it right, they're kind of big government moderates. That's sort of like, so I might instead of calling them populists, call them moderates, and say like, they're the kind of people that support, and I would say they're kind of right-leaning, right? If you could, like, anti-immigration right-leaning, but they're not the kind of people that want to deport a bunch of people that are already here. They're the kind of people that are like, yeah, we should enforce border protection.
Legal path to immigration.
Right. I'm not sure about the vaccine mandates. Well, we don't really have those anymore, thank God. And like, yeah, they probably aren't for economic regulation, but the question is what kind? And so I think, I want to do a little more reading and digging into that before I definitively say it. But what I would see is that the real way to win is to kind of be a Trump without the crazy, So like if you could, basically what Trump did is say, I'm going to be economically liberal and socially conservative. Now, I think people like us immediately think abortion, right? When we think socially conservative, or we think Christian right from us growing up with a moral majority in it. I think that's not what it means. I think it means more like we're not obsessed by race and DEI. We are patriotic, and we generally believe in things like marriage, but we don't really care that gays get married, right? And we think, men and women are what they are, and trans is a weird side issue. That's fine, but isn't like what we should all be talking about all day. I kind of feel like that's sort of socially conservative now. And like you see Trump, he's basically said, I'm not going to support a national abortion ban. And hey, if you want to be crazy in Mississippi, go ahead, but that's not going to hurt Pennsylvania, right? So I think that that's generally the way that the Republican Party is going to have to go in the future because they're just getting killed on abortion everywhere. And I think there's no way you're going to have that Reagan kind of conservative who's, you know, and this is the dream, right, of all the right-leaning people that live near us in these elite cities is like they want fiscally conservative, socially liberal candidates. That's not a winning coalition. No one wants that. They want economically liberal and socially conservative with these exceptions, right? They don't want to go back to like strict abortion bans and Christian conservatism. They want basic, like, I'm patriotic, I'm normal, I'm not going to sit here and take grievance studies courses, and I just want to live my life. That, you know, that's the winning coalition. And so I think that kind of probably more likely comes from the right. If you could get basically Trump's policies without his craziness.
Well, you mentioned Bernie circa 2016.
Yeah. So Bernie in 2016, I think the real thing that he represented was a kind of Trumpist populism on the left that wasn't, I mean, he was very economically class-based. He did not care really about gender and social justice issues, right? So I think if you could, in 2020, I think he kind of moderated on that. And I think he didn't do as well as a result because he, you know, the staunch progressives really don't love him for that. But I think if you could kind of get Bernie 2016 without that kind of social craziness, but he'd also have to adopt like a strongly nationalistic standpoint because you just aren't going to get like the big government populists, even the liberal, they call the liberal patriots, which are on the left. Sort of, there's a guy named Rudy Teixeira who he writes a newsletter called Liberal Patriot. They're kind of older liberals they love America. They think America's the best country in the world.
We're not MAGA.
Yeah, they're not MAGA. They hate the MAGAs, and they're kind of like old school left of center Democrats. They believe in, you know, government programs, but they're not socialists and blah, blah, blah. So like, you know, I think that they even won't vote for somebody who's kind of like, you know, a little too elitist, anti-American kind of feel. So I do think that the real winning combination from the right or the left is somebody who's like, I'm going to adopt populist, big spending economic policies and relatively conservative, with the exceptions we talked, pro-American, you know, what you might call socially conservative social policies. And I think that's the winning combination. And I think what prevents it is these extremes in the primaries.
Well, I was going to ask, does any such person exist?
Yeah, I mean, I do think it's Trump without the crazy.
Right.
I mean, the other thing about Trump is like what the hell does he believe? Like one day he's like some populist, and the next day he's like, I'm going to make Jamie Dimon the Treasury Secretary. It's like, what? Where did that come from, right? So, I mean, that's the other thing about Trump is he's just makes up as he goes along. So it's hard to say, like, what does he represent? I have a picture in my mind of like the set of policies that should go around somebody like Trump, but he's so erratic and all over the place that he doesn't always represent his own policies. So, yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, if you looked at the last election, the primaries, like DeSantis got the social part mostly right, but I think he was still a Reagan conservative on the fiscal side. So he's not going to win. And I think Nikki Haley was way too, like, she wants to invade every country she's ever been to. And it's like, that's not going to go, right? And she's total. So, like, I don't know if there was a tribune of this. I mean, Trump was that person, right? And then on the left, we just, you know, we haven't had a real battle there. One of the reasons I think Kamala Harris getting the nomination is so tragic is there are a bunch of people on the left, I think, you know, some of the governors they have that might be able to unite these coalitions in different ways that have like real political talent. And I think we have to see, I mean, it's been longer, you know, like I think what happened in 2020, I don't know if the Democratic Party had gone through enough of a realignment at that point. And basically what they did is say, hey, let's take the guy who's kind of in the middle on everything and put him in. That's not what the Republicans did, right? And I'm not so sure the Democrats will do that again. It'll be interesting to see. But if I were an aspiring candidate, if I was a Democrat, I'd be looking, how do I position myself as a populist economically with a strong patriotic streak, right? that's the winner, in my view.
Let's see what happens in a month and a half.
Exactly. It'll be interesting. Although, as my other post said before, I think a few weeks ago I wrote, I don't think it's going to make that much difference. I mean, the only way it can ever make a difference is if you sweep in with a 60-seat Senate majority and a House majority. And that's not happening. The election's so close.
That's when you wrote, now that the party doesn't really matter.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think so. Until there's a big realignment, like until you have like a Reagan-like win where you kind of sweep out, I think what Reagan did is really like win all those traditional Democrats who didn't like the direction of the party, the Southern and National Conservative Democrats. He really brought them in. And like, we have to see somebody do something like that. That's what I'm saying. Like, I think the person who unites these factions of economically populist and patriotic, socially conservative patriotic, I think that person creates a realignment that's Reagan-like. And we just haven't seen it. So that's when it'll change. Because they'll, maybe not their first election, but if they're really popular, you can get something like Reagan in '84 where he won every state except for one or two.
You have the data.
Well, if you read Substack all day, that's what happens. And watch YouTube. Well, someone was laughing at me last week about how I start everything I'm going to say. Like, that's what I do. I listen to podcasts and read Substack professionally, so you don't have to.
Exactly. It's a service. You're providing a service. Public service, Alan. Do you want to touch on what you were writing about?
Yeah, it's a little connected to that.
Yeah, absolutely. You started talking about the long-term economic forces are more important, right, than actually who's in power, and you would ask the question, what are we actually fighting about? And then you brought up Jonathan Haidt, who's the NYU sociologist. So why don't you tell us about him?
Yeah. So my conceit with the newsletter and with the new rules is that like, I don't want to be about what's happening today. Like, I don't want to give you like my debate take or something like that. Who cares? Plenty of people do that. I want to look at the longer term issues that are behind it. And so, but I argue about this stuff with my friends and stuff like everybody else. And, I really started thinking as we're arguing or, I'm discussing these things with people. Like, we're trapped in these little issues, right? It's like, oh, well, the press did this to Trump and they did this to Harris or whatever, And then all of a sudden, every time I get trapped in small, like little conversations like that, I feel like they're very closed. I start thinking like, okay, I want to go back up to the top and say like, what's going on here? Why am I always in an argument with you about this? Like, there's got to be something more to it than like A, B, C happens and we disagree about it. There's some framework that we're bringing to the table that's different because we view everything differently. And some people say, oh, that's because like your media shapes what you see. But to be honest, there's some ways you get attracted to certain media for certain reasons, right? So why are you attracted to that? Like, why does my brother read the goddamn Guardian? It's just a little complaint for me. Yes, I know why. And my other brother's watching MSNBC all day, so I'm like God man now. But so I started thinking about it, and it turns out, hey, I'm not the first person in the world who's ever had this idea. Like, people have looked out and said, what are the fundamental differences here, right? And sometimes in the sense of right and left, but sometimes just in the way the world is shaped and who people are and those kind of things. So the first thing, the most recent thing that people have talked about is Jonathan Haidt, this professor. He was at UVA, now at NYU. He developed this theory that, I think it was a moral framework theory.
Moral foundations theory.
He and a couple other people did a bunch of surveys and focus groups and, theorizing. And they basically decided that really we have a set of values that cut across things like fairness and, sanctity and
care versus harm, liberty, oppression.
And these are axes that people value more or less of, right? So not that somebody who believes in liberty doesn't, liberty and oppression are in a little bit of a dichotomy and the two sides view them a little bit differently, but both prize them in different ways, right? And so he tried to kind of say that the left and the right really weight one of those values or a set of those values more on one side than the other, right? So he tried to say that, like for, a left-leaning person, oppression is really what they're focused on. And they least identify it with something like sanctity or authority or something like that, right? So, and then like on the right, they would prize things like sanctity and authority, like order and society, more than they would worry about oppression, or like liberty would be more important to them than oppression. And I agree that there's something there, and it's an interesting frame, but I think that it kind of lacks, I don't know, you can poke a lot of holes in it, right? So, like the thing one person said to me, and I put this in the piece, that think about the way that really extreme staunch progressives talk about Trump and democracy, like democracy. And Trump has defiled our democracy, right? I mean, that's like strong sanctity focused language.
Or that it's the end of democracy.
Right. Yeah, that it's the end and he's corrupted it. And, like it's very similar to like Christian right language about, the corruption of man. And so, that you would say that conservatives would adopt, right? So it felt to me like they kind of both do that, right? And if you think about authority or something like that, like prizing, like conservatives prize authority, and that's one of the things that distinguishes them. I don't know. Did you live through the pandemic where like every other yard sign in Bethesda had something about like trust the science and thank you, Dr. Fauci, and and like I don't know, Joseph Stalin didn't have any problem with authority, right? So it kind of got me thinking like, I don't know. There's enough like exceptions on both sides. It doesn't really feel, although I like, thinking through it, it's very helpful. I didn't feel compelling as like fundamentally what we're arguing about.
It provides a good framework, but it's not specific enough.
It doesn't provide enough of a clean line for me to understand, like, why is my brother always reading The Guardian and I'm reading, well, I actually don't read the reverse, but why am I reading Substack or something, right? So, and I don't watch Fox News, just to be clear. So thinking through that, and then it's like, okay, but like this isn't, Jonathan Haidt isn't the first person that came up with this either. And that's when I really started thinking through like, okay, you think about where did this stuff come from, really? I was a political science major, we read about Edmund Burke, who was English parliamentarian during the latter half of the 1700s. And he's considered sort of the father of modern conservatism. And he wrote a really important, I think it was a pamphlet or a series of speeches called Reflections on the Revolution in France. And that's where he kind of articulated this idea, because, they were really worried in England as the revolution gained steam in Paris. They were really worried, hey, that's going to come over here and try to destroy our system.
Same thing's going to happen.
So his is basically a defense of the English system. And so what is he emphasizing? He's emphasizing tradition. He's emphasizing
pragmatism.
And he's sort of like saying, don't think we can all make the world anew each time. If we try to just wipe the slate clean and create something better because all this oppression has happened and it's built up, like you're throwing the baby out with the bathwater and you're going to end up in a dark place. And so he wrote that it was before the Reign of Terror. So it was like 1791 or something. And like 2 years later, they're chopping people's heads off by the dozen. And I think, just the fever of the revolution heated up, and human nature being what it was, these authoritarians, right, on the left came in and started killing everybody. And I think we've seen that multiple times in revolutions, even, in the Arab Spring that we just saw. And so, he was proven right. Like, hey, you try to wipe away everything and start anew, it's not going to go well for you. And so, like, what's behind that to me is Burke doesn't believe that people are really a blank slate. So then it's like, okay, what is that belief that he's fighting against? And really the representative of that, sort of the father, not the father of the revolution, but a little bit, is Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who was a French philosopher earlier in the 1700s. They actually overlap for a couple decades, I believe. But he wrote a lot about, his famous quote I put in the article is, man is born free and everywhere is chains. So first of all, he was a sexist.
That's another
Right. But he meant in the bigger sense we used to mean. And actually he was kind of a jackass. He like abandoned his children and wife and all this stuff. So look behind your moral ideologue.
You'll ruin it for the philosophy geeks.
Yes, right. Basically his statement there means, hey, everyone's kind of born free and equal.
And perfect.
I think that's the reductio ad absurdum of his belief, but I don't think he would really say that. But yeah, I mean, he's basically saying people are, or they're at least perfectible. They might not be born perfect. If society didn't mess us up, it's really, so his view is society is what's putting the chains on, right? That's why man and women are in chains. It's because we take whatever, you get born into the wrong social class, or you're the wrong color, or you're the wrong hair type, or you're this, or you're that, you're too small. Society is discriminating and oppressing you for various reasons so that others can have power. So they're putting everybody in shackles, right? So this is the exact opposite of what Burke's saying. Burke's saying it's those very shackles that keep people's heads from getting cut off in the guillotine. And Rousseau's saying, look, if we just got rid of all the shackles, we'd all be free and perfect. And so I think that these guys really represent the two views. And of course, there's others of, Locke and John Locke and Hobbes and Marx, they all kind of go around these axes. But I think these two, with their cross and the time they lived, kind of really demonstrate this. And to me, it's in the end, what we're fighting about is, are humans a blank slate and therefore perfectible? Or are they born flawed? And basically, you get rid of a lot of the constraints around them at your own peril. And so, are we born flawed or are we born perfect? Is sort of a simplified version of this.
Of what we're talking about today.
And so, I don't think not many people believe the extreme of one or the other, right?
No.
We're all fighting about where it is in between. But to me, it's helpful to think about it. And look, I think both sides have a point. If you just leave the chains on all the time, then you don't free the slaves. You don't stop Jim Crow. You don't stop genocide somewhere, those kind of things.
Segregation.
Exactly, all that stuff that is clearly even the most extreme right way. I mean, there's a few people over on the crazy end, but most conservative people would not deny that those were good things, right? But on the other hand, we can't deny the fact that the effort to make people perfect has led to the immiseration of billions of people and, frankly, straight out murder of hundreds of millions under people like Pol Pot, Mao, Stalin and Lenin and the French revolutionaries. And, the perfect one is, I remember reading this in college about Pol Pot. It's a dictator of Cambodia. It's part of the Khmer Rouge, where the book and the movie The Killing Fields come up from. He declared it the year zero when he took over.
Because he was just starting the human calendar.
Everything's starting anew. And then what happens? They're filling fields with bodies. That's because humans aren't going to start over in a blank slate. They aren't a blank slate. But then, again, on the right, if you allow for no progress, to be fair with Burke, he would say, I want gradual progress. So he wouldn't deny that there's progress. But I do think there are times when rapid progress is called for. And there are cases like, hey, you have a slave owning class that is profiting off of these people. They are not going to gradually free the people, right? Because that's their livelihood, right? So we had to fight a civil war about it and make it happen. And that's an extreme, very sudden change. And that was called for, right? So I don't think we can say definitively that one side's right or wrong. I tend to think the right, my personal opinion, I think the right is a little bit more accurate. And I don't think people are a blank slate by any measure. I think genetics clearly makes that not true. But it is a super important truth that if you allow the right to just say, well, things shouldn't change or the pace isn't fast enough, if you just allow that to be the truth, that's not going to be optimal either. So there has to be this tension and this fight. And so to be honest, and the other thing I pointed out is you could probably say that Plato, who lived in 400, 300 BC?
BC.
Great philosopher, was kind of an authoritarian leftist. And Aristotle was sort of a proto-conservative. I mean, not really. There's plenty of room for people to argue with that. But it's not, like just to make the point that people have been talking about this for 3,000 years, right? So the fight is going to remain. The next election is not going to result in a nirvana for your people.
Make it clear to everyone listening.
So look, you can have a revolution and take over, and things are going to go, if either side is allowed too much power for too long, they will create a dysfunctional environment, whether it be right or left, because they both have bad tendencies within them. And it's only the tension between them that goes back and forth, right? That keeps us on a track that is ultimately better for all of us. So I do think like my takeaway is very, my little hallmark message at the end is when you really think about it, we do have fundamental views that are different, that are rooted in these things, but the tension between them brings, curbs the excesses of both and allows like sort of a consensus between the two to emerge over time. And that's productive. And to be honest, that's what our political system harnesses, those tendencies, and that's good. So like the fight is part of what it is. And so embrace the fight. Don't try to get rid of it.
Without going to the extremes too much. I think it's interesting you bringing up, this is like philosophy 101 here, which is great. It's probably not what the average person would expect to be talking about when we're talking about the current election cycle and the political environment that we're living right now. But it's interesting to provide a framework about just thinking about this stuff from a broader perspective.
Right. And if you can drop a Burke quote on some progressive, you are going to be the man or woman of the hour. Or you get some crazy MAGA person and you drop that man is born free, but everywhere is in chains. You are winner, chicken dinner, I think. So that's what the newsletter's for. A little sarcasm there. Cool. But I think for this week, we've learned about the power of energy, solar scalability. We've learned about how, to be honest with you, the whole idea about what we're fighting about and the two sides and the needed tension is a good framework for looking at those voter clusters that we talked about too, because you can see how those clusters are kind of like on that spectrum, right? From the center out to the extremes. And it's the coordination between those eight that kind of makes it interesting. And political entrepreneurs, I appreciate a good politician and someone who knows how to work the system. And I think a good politician is going to figure out how to take enough of those people on one side and kind of balance themselves over here with a majority coalition. But it's only the person that understands that it's a continuum and there are groups along that continuum. And I have to craft a strategy that gets me the 50, 60% that's going to win. So they should listen to this podcast and read the newsletter so they learn how to take over the presidency. That's the key.
Yeah. Take over the presidency.
Take over. Be elected to the presidency. Yeah.
And then the world.
And then the world, right? So they can finally either blank slate or non-blank slate the entire world.
Can I just say I love the term political entrepreneurs? I haven't heard that.
Yeah, no, I think we should talk more about it because we hate politicians in America, at least, and most people hate politicians. I always say that it's the world's second oldest profession. So get used to it. They're going to be around, right? Lobbyists are the third. But I do appreciate someone who understands how to build a coalition to create change. In the end, I agree with people that politicians that exist only to get power, it's a little boring and pathetic, I think. But people who are trying to really create change, even in an ego-driven way, I think it's really important. And actually, I'm going to talk about this. Maybe I'll write about this for not this week, but the week after. And I talked a little bit about it with my posts on Bill Gurley, the venture capitalist. But I think the people who are like that today, the Elon Musk, the Jeff Bezoses, the Bill Gates, they go into tech and business because that's where you can change the world. They don't become presidents now because being president isn't that. Everybody knows your name and you get to fly around on a cool airplane. But if I'm Microsoft, you get a cool airplane too. And but they're actually changing the way people live their lives. And so I think people like Napoleon would have been, an AI company leader today.
Can you imagine?
So I think eventually we do need, look, the U.S. is like like Warren Buffett always said, I want a company so good that a ham sandwich can run it because someday one will. And like the U.S. is a country so good that a ham sandwich can run it, except during very key transition points where you need someone good.
Except for the politicians.
Right. No, but I mean, I think mostly, what Chester A. Arthur was a president and the country was just fine. He wasn't that great, right? I mean, it was fine.
People are like, who is that? Who is Chester Arthur?
Yeah, he was the only president. Was he the only one from Vermont? No, that was
No.
Coolidge was from Vermont.
I know we're wrapping up, but we didn't mention, what was his name? Kotlikoff, Lawrence Kotlikoff. And he basically was talking about, we need economists to run the country, not politicians.
And to me, that's a perfect description of libertarianism, which is the way the world should be run if it weren't for the people. So like if we were all robots, maximum seeking, utility seeking robots, libertarianism would be a very effective economic policy, but we're not. And, I think a lot of Kotlikoff was on a show with Glenn Lowry, who's an economist at Brown, and Kotlikoff said, I can't remember where he is now, maybe Harvard. I don't know, academic economist. And he's been very involved in political policy type issues. And I agree with a lot of this.
He ran for president.
Yeah, on a weird, like third party kind of thing that wasn't, intended to win. It was intended to get ideas out. But, I think he really represents, and many of the policies he proposes are really good. I took serious issue with his trade policy because he kind of represents a very classic free trade neocon and doesn't recognize the reality of other countries like China at the size they are running massive industrial policies has huge impacts on the United States that need to be ameliorated or else we have serious problems, right? So I think, I can go into that deeper. I talked a little bit about it last week and I'm going to write more about it.
Yeah, listen to last week's episode, your primer.
But I think the real thing I took away from it is you got a lot of good ideas, but nobody cares about ideas. What you need to do is put together that coalition. It's helpful for that coalition to have the best ideas possible. But really, the political entrepreneur isn't some policy person. It's a person who figures out how to collect enough of the coalition. They espouse policies as part of doing that. But yeah, saying this is the best thing we should do is it has a role in the system. But again, if you had an enlightened group of technocrats that could run your country, of course that would all work, but that never works out. And you get a bunch of self-serving technocrats who do whatever the they want. And you need politicians fighting in the arena. And yes, they use frappy methods and they talk about price controls for grocery stores, and they want to make the Fed political and, all these there's stupid ideas. I get it. But the reality is the president in the next 4 years is going to be a ham sandwich. Doesn't matter that much. And, but eventually we'll get to this point where we need a real policy entrepreneur. I think we're in the late stages of this need for a political realignment to get the country and, quite frankly, the West onto a better trajectory.
Do you mean late stages of realizing the need for it, a realignment?
Yeah, I think until then, the last president before, talking of only one state, James Buchanan is the only president from Pennsylvania, and possibly our only gay president. But he was a terrible president. He was the last president before the Civil War, right? So I think we're on a trajectory. We're not going to Civil War, but I do believe we're on a trajectory for a major realignment and shift as part of the new rules that I talk about. And as we drift toward that, I don't think it's going to happen now. I don't know if it'll happen in 4 years or 8 years. It depends. I think the next president isn't going to be that important. They're not going to be, they might be important in the way that they create conflict or they highlight some issue, but nothing's going to happen because we're in a deadlock.
Or more division or unity in the culture wars.
I think there'll be more division no matter what. There's no unity coming.
That is true.
The only unity will be, I hate those people, right? That's the only unity. Until we have somebody that can unite enough of those coalitions to really shift the political environment. And so you're going to have to see, the Bernie bros voting for the Trump candidate not Trump, but Trump-like candidate. You're going to have to see those kind of shifts. You're going to have to see Dick Cheney leaving the Republican Party and voting for Democrats because they want to invade more countries. Or, I'm not saying that's what will happen. I'm just saying that's the kind of shifts you're going to have to see.
That's the kind of thing you're referring to.
And I think the whole point of this newsletter is me trying to, not just the political, because political isn't the most important thing. The most important thing are the long-term trends in the economy, demographics, politics, geopolitics, everything together. And then the politics is going to reflect or going to react to that either well or poorly, mostly poorly. And, that's what we're tracking here. And I think we still haven't gone through the major realignment that's going to result. I think Trump was a signal, but not a result. He's not the result. Plus, he's not a good enough politician. He knows how to get attention. He doesn't know how to get attention and then turn it into change. And that's what, look at Elon Musk. You can hate him, but he gets attention and then he does shit and it works. So that you're going to have somebody like that who can bring those two things together to make a real shift in my mind.
A long term. Americans, we're not very good at thinking long term, though, often. We want short term gratification fixes. So this newsletter is, again, a good starting point.
Yeah. And I to be honest, I know some of what I think the new rules are, but I don't know all of them. I mean, I think there's stuff happening that nobody really understands. And my goal is to get more than 50% right. That's about it. And to learn and change and document that process. But I don't think anyone knows exactly what's going to happen. But I think everyone can feel that it's definitely a shift, right? Like we had a relatively stable world from the early 80s to about 2016. Maybe you could say the great financial crisis was sort of the symbol of the end of that era, but it kind of went on after
2008. Yeah.
But I think really the pandemic was the last. And now we're going into this new world. And
I don't think anybody knows what it is.
I'm not a cycle believer. I think that vaguely things go one way and then they kind of go back a little bit the other way over some period of time, 40, 50 years, something like that. I don't think it's any law, and I don't believe in these turnings. There's all these fourth turning, blah, blah, blah. I think it's kind of bull. But yeah, I mean, I do think that you had 40, 50 years of globalization, neocon economic policies, strong, American leadership. And now we're going to go into 50 years where the U.S. is like, hey, is this worth it to us? We're only going to do the stuff that really matters to us. And we're not going to protect the sea lanes, so the trade. And we're not happy with what happened with China. So trade's going to go down. And, demographics are changing. People aren't having as many kids. So I just think we're now in the shift back to another cycle. So that's what the newsletter's really about. And you got to go drink wine and play pool or something. That's what Europeans do, isn't it?
Got to drink wine and eat olives.
Okay, excellent. And hammam.
Yeah, not so much of that.
No? They don't kick you out for not eating hammam?
You do get funny looks sometimes.
Do you then go, I'll eat an anchovy, and then they're cool?
No, it's I'll just have some patatas bravas.
Well, they're in on that. Right. Cool. All right. Thanks, Tonya. We'll see you next week.
All right, Alan.
You've been listening to The New Rules with Alan Pence. For more insights on mastering the new game, follow @apentz, that's APENTZ, on X, and make sure to subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss a single episode. Thanks for tuning in, and remember, in today's world, you don't follow the rules, you write them.